Okay, good morning. I'm here with Dr. Darryl Inaba. He's Associate Professor of Pharmacology at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco. He's Director of Clinical and Behavioral Health Services at ARC, Addiction Recovery Center in Medford, Oregon. He's Special Consultant and Instructor for the University of Utah School of Alcoholism and Other Drug Dependencies, as well as Director of Education at Research at CNS Production, and he's on the editorial board of the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. So thank you, Dr. Inaba, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to answer a few of my questions.
Thank you very much for having me, Mr. Hirose. I'm looking forward to working with you in Canada.
Yeah, so it must keep you really busy updating all the research, new research and studies that are coming in to update your books and all your research articles.
Well, it's really a labor of pleasure, a labor of love. The research that's happening on addiction right now is probably the top scientific research that's happening in the world. So much so that it's on the cover of our National Geographics here, our Time magazine. Instead of putting pictures of people overdose and dying of drugs and stuff like that, they're putting pictures of the brain and highlighting the research on what addiction is showing and the treatment of addiction is happening.
Right. Now, Dr. Inaba, I worked in the area of addictions for over 20 years, mainly an outpatient. And I used your book and I constantly referred to it, uppers, downers, and all arounders. I noticed it's in its 8th edition, and it's also used by 400 colleges and universities throughout North America. That's really an accomplishment to you for all the work you've done in the field to keep everything updated and to give everyone practical information.
Well, thank you for mentioning the book, and I'm very proud of the book. Actually, all of the information I get encouraged, inspired to do, and all of the routes that I'm pursuing in the book have been stimulated by my clients. I continue to do clinical work, have groups, individual clients. They continue to stimulate my interest in pursuing the science of addiction.
Great. Now, in preparation for the Skype interview, I prepared a number of questions, and I know we don't have enough time in this 10 or 15 minutes, and that's why individuals need to attend your workshop at the conference in Edmonton, but hopefully we'll touch the surface of some of these questions. And so to start, in your view, are some individuals more predisposed to substance use disorders due to differences in one's composition of the brain and differences genetically?
It's more than my view. I mean, it's pretty well established in science to the point that in America, there is an actual law that was passed in 2008 called the Addiction Equity Act that makes addiction now a valid chronic persistent medical disorder, not unlike somebody having diabetes or hypertension. And it's due to brain anomalies or differences in the brain and brain chemistry and connections brain cells make. And only certain individuals, not all individuals who drink alcohol will become alcoholic, or people who try heroin will become heroin addicts, only certain few. Those few are been confirmed. We've recognized at least 89 genes that play a role in making somebody more susceptible or less susceptible to specific drugs or other drugs of addiction. We also know that those genes are vulnerable to something called epigenetics, or an actual twisting of the DNA, so that you get an expression of recessive over dominant genes that move people toward addiction. And then you have the environmental factors, especially trauma. And trauma really affects the brain and its development. And finally, there's the drugs themselves that can cause changes in the brain, but certain people are definitely more prone or more predisposed or have a propensity to develop addictions. And we also have people who may never develop addictions.
Right. It's going to be interesting at the conference in Edmonton because we'll have Dr. Stanton Teal presenting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, and I'll be doing a Skype interview with him next week. So, with these conferences, it's good to have different perspectives.
We're about as far apart as possible. Stanton's been, of course, in the field for a long time talking about, there isn't such a thing as disease, that people have these social conditions and behaviors. And so it's always wonderful to be on the same platform and see how far apart we are, or maybe even coming closer together.
Right. Yeah. In second question, in October 2018, the Federal Cannabis Act came into effect and made Canada the second country in the world to formally legalize the cultivation, possession, acquisition, and consumption of cannabis. What are your thoughts on this development?
Well, it's going to be an interesting experiment, and I wish that Canada as a nation would have waited to look at what's happening in the United States in terms of the states that have legalized it recreationally, and see what the issues were so that they can wisely create, if they were going to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, they want to be sure to cover things like what's about driving under the influence, what about the overdose, who's going to take care of people who get addicted. Not everybody will get addicted to cannabis, but from our research here, about 9 or 10% of people who try marijuana will develop what we call cannabis use disorder, and how they get treated. It's interesting here because we have this opiate epidemic, and our nation has invested into treating the opiate epidemic. Recently, our federal government says, well, you can use the money we're giving you to treat the opiate epidemic, but none of it could be used to treat the cannabis addiction in states that have legalized it. So right. you have that kind of thing to look at. Also, the developing research on the brain aspects, especially adolescent aspects, the schizophrenia, IQ aspects, and a lot of different things are happening that would have been more sagacious for Canada to wait to see what's happening and then amend or make their legislation address those issues. Portugal is the other country, I guess, that's legalized marijuana, and there's some lessons that could be learned from them as well.
Great. So when we examine the science on cannabis, should we be concerned about the long-term health consequences, particularly with adolescents and their social and emotional cognitive development?
Absolutely. The adolescent brain is very different from the adult brain, and it's in development. And early exposure to drugs that can affect what I call the addiction pathway and affect certain structures in the brain that marijuana definitely does, pre-exposes that person to not only addiction problems, but social problems, educational problems, a variety of health issues that are of major concern. Our mantra should be in this country, since it's in Oregon where I'm at, it's been legalized in this state. Right. Our prevention efforts have changed to telling kids, hey, please wait. It's illegal, first of all, for them to smoke marijuana until they're 21, but that never stopped people from using alcohol on an underage issue. And that's what we're seeing as a problem here in Oregon developing. And we're trying to say, please wait, give your brain a chance to develop before you expose it to a drug that can infect you for life.
Right. Should we be concerned about the high concentrations of THC found in cannabis? From what I understand, it's like a different drug compared to the 60s and 70s. And I know here in BC, the THC levels are extremely high.
Absolutely. I mean, it's no comparison. I mean, the University of Mississippi in the United States have been sent a sample of every street sample of marijuana confiscated by law enforcement agencies. They've been monitoring the percentage of THC, the main psychoactive chemical in marijuana. And in the 60s, 70s, it was only about 1% to 2%. Now it's in the United States. I don't think you can find in any dispensary I've been in anything under 21, 22%, up to 25, 30%. British Columbia and many places that are producing their own cannabis have very high amounts of THC in it. In that, we see cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, people who develop uncontrollable vomiting that's extremely painful and puts them in the emergency room, believe it or not, to deal with vomiting. We've seen actual seizure disorders, and cannabis is supposed to control seizures, but it creates seizures. I'm seeing long-term users, people who smoke marijuana their whole lives without any major issues they felt, actually feigning going into the hospital in minor syncope or comas for marijuana. And then we're looking at this development of major psychosis, major schizophrenia, even testicular cancers. Just so much is happening with research findings now that marijuana is legal and available, and we're seeing what happens, especially in the higher concentrations. Then there's the issues of synthetics, Mr. Hirose, that I don't think is well being addressed. The synthetic marijuanas are so much more potent and creating much more problems than we realize, and are being added to some of the vaping products and things like that to give the boost in the psychoactive effects, but causing a lot of problems, as you're sure you're monitoring there, and the vaping issues that are happening in this country.
Right. So I know you're going to cover a lot of information about drugs in detail at the conference. I have a couple more questions to ask. One is about trauma. I read that trauma changes the structure and chemistry of the brain. Does previous trauma make one more vulnerable to addictions?
Yeah, there is so much research, even some current research that have correlated pretty convincingly to me that especially early childhood adverse events or early childhood trauma, especially is deleterious to the development of brain cells themselves. They affect the brain cell connections, they affect brain cell chemistry, they affect the dendrites, and the association is very clear. If you've experienced early childhood trauma, you're much more prone to addiction, much more prone to social problems, much more prone to a lot of illnesses and diseases. And so trauma is a missed issue that we haven't really well addressed a long time in our culture, and we need to address it in order to get on top of many of these things.
Right. Now, one final question. In your view, what obstacles get in the way of successfully adhering to a long-term program of abstinence?
Well, there is a myriad of issues that really, to start off with, on a biological basis, the brain of an addict is a hijacking their basic instinctive survival mechanism. It's not a matter of them pleasure seeking or willful misconduct or, purposely taking the drug just to get drunk or high. But those who are prone to addiction, it hijacks an unconscious, subconscious level of survival, their survival instincts. So it's a hijacking of one's survival instincts that makes one compulsive and obsessive about using drugs. Once that brain is addicted, then a conspiracy of that brain develops, conspiracy with different brain cells, different parts of the brain, different brain chemistry and connections, and different biological processes that cause an addict to continue their use of drugs. And that is the biggest problem with continuing long-term abstinence, is the craving and the gnawing, that conspiracy that's set up of the brain. We now have a biological understanding of that. And in this country anyway, there's a whole movement. The state of Washington, for instance, became the first state that mandated all treatment programs have to have, as of January 1st, a connection of their clients to medication-assisted treatment. Medications that are developed to target that unconscious process of the brain to help with the craving, help people maintain their sobriety. And then there's a lack of resources, there's a lack of support system, there is a lack of family involvement, interest. There's a lot of things that work against an addict to maintain and obtain and maintain their long-term sobriety. And these are things we are identifying and trying to develop so that we can have programs. There are programs in this country who have phenomenal success rates. The Addicted Physicians Program, for instance, have about 97% of people who enter, not just people who complete their programs, but 97% of people who enter those programs never relapse. They remain clean and sober for the rest of their lives. Addicted Pilots programs. Now, what's the difference? Well, they're addressing in those issues, and they have resources. They have what I call recovery capital to address those. Our basic programs here, even the one I'm working in, the Addictions Recovery Center, we don't have the resources to provide all the things that help addicts maintain long-term sobriety. And if we continue to work on that, maybe we can develop that so we can encourage or actually promote better outcomes in our treatment.
Excellent. Now, one final question. You're offering a full-day workshop at our Trauma and Addiction Conference in Edmonton. Can you just share a little more about what you intend to cover and what participants might gain and learn by attending your workshop that day?
Well, I'm hoping to share everything that I've learned in the 50 plus years I've been in this field and share with them, especially the evolving science of addiction, just the amazing features of science. In that, we've pretty much mapped out the whole biological process of addiction, and we can recognize even brain cells that are addicted from brain cells that are not addicted. We know what the causes of addiction is, and the many research that's involved with the causes of addiction. That leads me then to then talk about how this impacts treatment and why there is this development and what the outcomes are showing in terms of now looking at addiction not only from a psychosocial point of view, but also from a medical point of view, addressing the underlying biological features and why that's developing in this country and what those developments are, including some very, very far out scientific things. At Stanford right now, they're actually starting to put brain implants in human beings and putting pacemakers in so that they don't crave and fall back to opiate abuse. There's a rebirth of magnetic pulsing in the brain. At my program here in Oregon, we actually use an RO stimulator. We actually stimulate acupuncture points in the ear electronically to help people maintain. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff going on, and I hope to cover that. A final section of it is to spend a little bit of time on that issue of relapse. Why certain people relapse more than other people. What are the resources that we have to help prevent them from developing relapse issues? If weaving into that is the theme of your conference is trauma. What we've learned about trauma and how it impacts addiction, how it brings about addiction, and how it maintains addiction. How come, if you don't address the stress and trauma in people's lives and they don't address it themselves, they have very little chance of continued success in maintaining sobriety. So that's going to be involved with the whole process as well of the presentation I'm hoping to make in Canada. If we have time, I will weave into that the developments with the individual drugs themselves, what our heroin crisis looks like, what cannabis legalization is doing, what the research on that is going on. We're also, strangely, in this country and on the East Coast, having still that opiate epidemic, but on the West Coast, a renewed methamphetamine and cocaine epidemic, and what that looks like and what the different drugs are and why that's continued to exist. Alcoholism continues. We're having an increase in women overdosing and dying of alcohol, and I would weave into that as well. So I hope to cover that, and I hope to be available and open so that people can bring me up to date on what they're seeing, what they're doing, what they're interested in. And if I can answer any questions on that, that's always, I love to do that. Sometimes I like to do that more than continue with the lectures I have planned. So I'm really looking forward to it, especially because of your interests and the people in Canada. I'm very happy to interact with them and maybe see the similarities and differences we have in this country.
Well, thank you, Dr. Inaba, for taking the time to answer a few of my questions today. And I'm really looking forward to meeting and working with you up in Edmonton. And I was just delighted when I found out that you were agreeable to coming up to Canada to share your knowledge and your wisdom. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hirose.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Inaba will be providing a full-day workshop on the topic of current science of addiction and recovery, dispelling the stigma, at our upcoming Trauma and Addiction Conference in Edmonton on May 27th, 28th, and 29th this spring. And my company, JackHirose&Associates, has again teamed up with the Sunshine Coast Health Center to put on this conference. So I hope to see you all there. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.